I'm Kate Still. I'm from the Soil Association. I manage our farming programs there, and this is the part 2 of a 2-part series that we've done looking at Herbal Leys. So we've partnered up with Agricology, the Soil Association, and sort of Fabulous Farmers as the project that we're working with, because we were hoping to run an event back in March at Northwick, looking at all of the lovely projects they were doing around Herbal Leys, and Agricology were equally doing a lovely field day back before the COVID situation, and that was cancelled. So we all came together and had decided to put on these sort of virtual events, and there was so much to cover. We split it into 2. So the first session was 2 weeks ago, which I'm sure a lot of you will have attended, and that really sort of provided an introduction to Herbal Leys and talked about sort of species selection. There was lots on establishment and also sort of the environmental benefits, and looked at environmental schemes and all those sorts of things. So people who sent in questions around those sorts of topics, and you didn't attend the first session, then do watch back at the first session, which is available on YouTube, and you can find the link on the Agricology website, but we will also circulate it at the end of the session. So I'm sure lots of it will be covered then, because today we really are focusing on the bits that we hadn't covered then. So grazing, ensiling, and also the soil, the benefits of Herbal Leys to soil, which Becky wasn't able to cover back on 2 weeks ago. So so those are the sort of main topics today, but if you do have questions on other areas, then we do have lots of lovely experts hanging around in the ether. I know Becky Hughes is there from Southwest FWAG, and I think Hannah is there as well from Duchy possibly, and all sorts of other people who will be able to answer those questions as well. But yes, so we are mostly focusing on the ensiling, grazing, and the soils bit. So I will quickly pass on to Kat just to do a little bit of housekeeping. So if you want to do that.
Sure. Morning, everyone. Just a few points. So as we mentioned at the beginning, this is being recorded, which means that any of your questions, or if you're unmuted and chatting, that will also be recorded. It does also mean that if you want to watch it again later, then we'll be circulating this. So don't worry if your broadband drops out or anything. If on the subject of questions, you'll see on the right hand side of your screen, if you're viewing on a desktop, you've got the control panel. So there's this little speech bubble there, which is where the chat box is. So you can either send a question and send that to everybody so that everyone can see it, and then other participants might also respond, or you can choose to just send that to the organisers and it will just come to Kate and I. So if you're having problems with sound or the technology or anything, or want clarification, you can also just send that to us. Because we've got lots of people's webcams on, which is great, we can see so many of you, but if you're finding that distracting, at the top of your screen you've got the option to change from view everyone to view who's talking, and then you'll just see the presenters. And throughout, if you can, I've muted all of your microphones just so that just to avoid any background noise. So if you could keep yourself muted, and we'll unmute you if you want to chat. The only final thing is, if you find that the control panel and the chat screen is getting a bit distracting, there's a little arrow at the top there where you can collapse that, so you can just see the full slides and hear us speaking. I think that's everyone. Hope you have a good day.
Thank you, Kat. So right, let's get moving. So if you could just move me next on, I'll just run through the agenda and introduce everybody. So yes, so me briefly doing introduction. I'm already behind time, and then we've got the lovely Becky Wilson from Duchy College, who's going to be talking about soil health and carbon, which, as I say, she was hoping to do at the first session, but we've thankfully managed to carry her over into this session as she wasn't able to attend. And then we've got Sarah Morgan from Rothamsted and Jordana Rivero from Rothamsted, who are going to be looking at grazing in particular and talking about the projects that they've been involved with. And then we've got Kate Lecoq and Dave Davies, who are going to be looking at ensiling in particularly and the projects they're working on. And then I've got a very brief moment just to talk to you about Innovative Farmers Field Lab and talk to the lovely Clyde Jones, who's one of the farmers who I've been working with. Clyde, I hope you're out there somewhere, just to talk about some of his experiences in working with Herbal Leys. And then we do have more time for questions. So questions, as Kat said, if you can put them in the chat box, after each speaker, we will try and have 5 minutes to catch up on specific questions related to that topic the best we can in that time, and then as we need to, then we'll fall out into that last 20 minutes. So the plan is that we'll officially end at 1, but the speakers will be around afterwards if you've got burning things you want to talk to them about that you didn't get a chance to cover or we didn't cover for you in the session. Equally, we're all here and available to be emailed to and contacted afterwards. So, you know, if there was things that you would like to follow up on, then, you know, do get into contact afterwards. So that's the plan. So next one, Kat. So just 2 words on Fabulous Farmers. So there's a big Northwest European project that the Sword Association are a partner in, along with the National Trust and CEH within the UK. And it's really all about getting farmers to introduce measures and to take on management that increases functional agrobiodiversity on their farm. So basically delivering ecosystem services, delivering for biodiversity, and also working to reduce chemical use, which all is of economic benefit. And there's a whole load of measures that we're sort of encouraging farmers to introduce as part of this program, along with working with policy, and there's a load of research and monitoring looking at these options as well. You'll see on the slide the FAB measures that we are focusing on, and Herbal Leys, it comes within the sort of mixed cropping, rotating within arable that we're focusing on. And there's a lot of farmers who are really sort of embracing Herbal Leys, either as part of their livestock systems, grazing systems, or introduce them into their arable systems. So we have got a learning network which focuses particularly on Herbal Leys within the southwest of England. And if you're interested in being part of that, then please do get in touch with me. And then we're delivering these demonstration events and then also sort of recruiting demonstration farms, so we're able to monitor, you know, the impact of them introducing these sorts of measures on their farms. So yeah, it goes on for a couple of years. We're working, Sword Association are working in the southwest of England and also Wales, and National Trust are working in the east of England. So if you're interested in any of those measures, getting them onto your farm, expanding them on your farm, or, you know, more information, then please do get in touch with me about Fabulous Farmers. Right, and then the next one is, we were hoping to do a bit of polling because it's nice to get to hear who's out there, but unfortunately this package that we're using wasn't going to be able to provide exactly the polling we wanted. So I'm going to do this as a little tester to get people going in their chat box, and we can get a little feel for what's going on out there and who's out there. So if you could enter in the chat box, if you're currently growing Herbal Leys at the moment, obviously farmers out there, or, you know, advisors who are involved directly in managing land, if you could put a quick yes, no, or, you know, would be interested, like to, in the chat box, and then we can see. We got some likes too, we got some yeses, yes, 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 a couple of paddocks, yes, yes, yes. Amazing, we've got lots of yeses and likes too. Okay, so everyone is on board. Oh, we got an, yeah, okay. Drilling if we get some rain. Yeah, brilliant. Okay, super. So lots of people are certainly either doing it or would like to do it. And then the next one, which is interesting in relation to the drilling if we get some rain, is we were just interested looking back at the drought in 2018 and all of the problems that, you know, livestock farmers were having in terms of getting having available forage in that sort of mid-late summer. We were just wondering if people had been putting them in since 2018. There you go, drilled autumn 2018. Yes, so be interesting just to see the interest that we've got now in Herbal Leys is in response to the fact that people, you know, are struggling to get grass growing with all this dry weather that we keep having, obviously in light of the last blooming couple of months where we haven't had any rain. I don't know if anyone had anything much yesterday. We had hardly a dampening. Okay, brilliant. And then quickly on to the next one. So in terms of your Herbal Leys that people have got, are you grazing them? Are you cutting them? What are people doing with them? Are they cutting and then grazing aftermath? What are you doing? They're doing a bit of both, cutting and grazing, both. Yeah, okay. Grazing mostly, grazing and cutting. Okay, bit of a mix, mainly grazing. Super. And then we'll just move on to the last one. So what kind of stock are you grazing them with? Get a feel for if it's, because a lot of the work that I've been doing is with dairy farmers and you know, a real upsurge in people wanting to introduce Herbal Leys into their dairy systems, a lot about having available quality forage. But I know also obviously a lot of beef and sheep farmers are using them as well. Yep. So we've got a whole mix really, haven't we? Still beef, dairy, sheep when they start. Brilliant. Okay. Super. Well, everyone's got a hold of the chat box anyway, so that's lovely. And obviously lots of mixed interest in terms of how they're using it. So that's great. So I think before further ado, we will move on and start with Becky, who's going to talk to us about the benefits of Herbal Leys for soils. So over to you, Becky.
Brilliant. Okay, hopefully you can all hear me, and it's really nice to be here today. I work at Duchy College, so I'm involved in the AgriTech project down there, and I look after a couple of projects, one focusing on manure management with livestock farmers around the Farm Crap app, and then the second one is the soil carbon project, which I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about today. And to be totally honest, I feel a little bit of a fraud because although we are doing some work with Herbal Leys, and some of our farmers that are involved in the soil carbon project are growing Herbal Leys, it's not the ultimate, it's not the only thing we're looking at through this project. So I will pull some of the figures that we've found so far, but with the caveat that we're not finished the number crunching yet, and we're still working through some of the figures. But just to sort of look at some of the processes and some of the principles behind why farmers are growing Herbal Leys from the soil point of view, because a lot of the questions that I get asked, especially when we're doing carbon footprinting, is I planted a Herbal Ley, how much carbon is that holding me? And there seems to be a lot of opinions that these things are providing a good benefit in terms of soil. And if we look at what they're doing in terms of their growth habit and how we're managing them, that's there. So how can we start now to really show what's happening in the soil? Brilliant. Next slide, please. I'm not driving this, so we'll get there. There we go. So I suppose just to start off with, if we're looking at healthy soil, and obviously we could have this whole webinar talking about what is soil health and what is a healthy soil, but really if we break it down into its three component parts, what we're really looking at is trying to make sure that our soil is healthy, it has good physical health, so it has, you know, good levels of good structure, we're looking at what the texture's like, what the aggregation like, and how we're managing it in terms of the amount of air in there and water in there and all those sort of things. We're also looking that it's got a good chemical balance, so that we're looking at testing for pH and for nutrient levels, and then we're addressing those in order to grow good crops. But then we're also looking at the biological health, and it's quite interesting when we start talking about Herbal Leys and the opportunities that come with Herbal Leys, that, you know, where do these fit in terms of feeding that biology to allow optimum nutrient cycling and to allow everything to really start to function in a healthy way. And certainly where we're coming from on the soil carbon project is that soil carbon sits within all of these different pillars of soil health. So if we've got, you know, good levels of soil carbon, then we're getting good levels of aggregation, which means that we're getting good physical health and we're getting good physical conditions. We're also getting good nutrient levels. We're feeding the biology, we're providing the residues and the exudates and all those things that our biology need in order to do good nutrient cycling, in order to make the system work. So it's just worth thinking as we move through the next couple of slides that we need to start looking at how soil health works across the different areas that we manage as farmers. Thank you. Oh, hang on, I think we've gone one. Oh no, hang on. Okay. Oh, that's cool. Brilliant. And so these are some of the things when I'm out talking to some of our farmers that I'm being thrown back at in terms of what are the benefits of these sort of to grow these leys. And quite often it's always improved soil structure, improving organic matter levels, which again is really interesting when we start talking in terms of how we can use these as a strategy to improve sequestration that's going on in the farm. The whole idea of using herbal leys is a really good opportunity to improve soil microbial activity and biological cycling and all those sort of things going on underneath the soil, and then improve resilience. In terms of being able to access nutrients and water further down by using deep-rooting species. And a lot of these benefits are coming from this idea that we're not growing a monoculture, we're growing a plant community, and there's a diversity of plant species within the ley which is performing lots of different functions. And within that, we've also got a lot of these deep-rooting species, as I say, that are able to put their roots down deeper, they're able to mine nutrients, they're able to mine water, and actually be able to help with the sustainability of the system. Thank you. So what I'm going to show you a little bit about now is about our soil carbon project. And as I said, our soil carbon project is one of the AgriTech projects that's involved down in Cornwall. And it's a partnership project between Duchy College, Rothamsted Research, who are obviously doing some of the speaking later, and then also the University of Plymouth. Thank you. And what we're trying to do within the soil carbon project is really understand how we test for soil carbon, the impact of soil carbon, how does soil carbon fit with the wider carbon footprint of the farm, and really focusing on how we test it in the field. So we're working with a range of farmers, a range of soil types. Obviously, we've got a concentration in the southwest because that's where the majority of the funding comes from, but we also have sites around the rest of England as well. And we're really looking at soil organic matter, soil organic carbon. We're looking at what's going on at different depths throughout the soil profile. So the soil is split into 3 different depths. And then we're also looking at a range of proxy measures. So we're looking at how the soil is structured and its levels of compaction. We're looking at infiltration, so how water moves through the soil profile. We're looking at worm numbers and other biological indicators, and we're looking at aggregate stability to see whether we can link any of these proxy measures with the soil organic carbon information. So for those farmers that potentially don't want to take lab analysis, can we link any of these things that we can all do on our farms with the soil carbon levels to see whether we can evaluate how our fields are doing. We're also doing lots of management and crop history. And as I say, we're just under 90 farms that we're working with. And as I say, we're just started year three of sampling. Thank you. Super. So if we just look at a couple of those reported benefits that we're having, if we look at improved soil structure, it's really about those deep-rooting species and those chicories and other ones which can really put their roots down and can help break up compacted soils. That's a really important benefit that we're getting from these sort of leys. Also, what's quite interesting is that when they're going further down the soil profile, they can also put carbon deeper into the soil, which means that it's less likely to be released. So actually, you're holding that carbon further down, which means, as I say, it's less likely to be acted on by the soil microbes and come back out again. And then also looking in terms of when we're improving soil organic matter, that's also allowing us to look at the resilience of our businesses through looking at improved water holding capacity and infiltration. And as I say, if we can improve our soil organic matter, we can also massively improve the amount of water that our fields are able to hold. And that's really important, especially with the weather that we've got at the moment. And so what are we finding at the moment? We're finding in terms of our soil structure scores that we're doing, using VEST scores, so visual evaluation of soil structure. The average soil structure of some of our diverse fields is around 2, whereas the average soil structure across the rest of the cohort is about 2.4. So there's a slight improvement there. But again, these are early days. Thank you. What's been a really interesting thing that we've pulled out, and it's based on, it's sort of confirmed some of the work that's been done at Rothamsted previously, is that we've found that there's a really good relationship between soil organic carbon and aggregate stability. And aggregate stability is a test that you can all do at home. You just take a handful of soil out of the field and you dry it in an airing cupboard or in a sunny place for a few days, and then you submerge it in water and you see what happens to it. And what we want to happen is a bit like if you dunk a biscuit in a cup of tea and it disintegrates. That's what we don't want to happen. We want that biscuit to hold together, and that's what happens when your soil is submerged in water and has rainfall and all sorts of other things going onto it. We want those soil particles to hold together, and we want them to be glued together. And as I say, what we've found so far is that actually our diverse fields have got a lower score is good here. The score's from 0 to 5. 5 is bad, 0 is good. And our diverse fields have got a good aggregate score compared to the rest of the samples. But what I would just like to point out as a point of caution is that care is needed in the establishment method, because we've done a little bit of work on the TOMS trials at Stoke with some of my students. And what we found is actually in that first year after the trials were established, there wasn't an impact in terms of, we weren't seeing a difference between the control plots and the TOMS plots, because there was that cultivation. There's a lot of cultivation to get those trials established. So this is something that we're seeing further as those lays get going, and as they start to, we see the benefits from them. That's when some of these soil things come in, because as I say, cultivation will have a negative impact on aggregation. Next slide, please. And as I say, this is just 3 farms where we're starting to look at their soil organic matter levels over the different depths. Because as I say, we're taking soil organic matter 0 to 10, 10 to 30, and 30 to 50. And these are just 3 examples. You can see the different soil organic matter percentages from year 1 and year 2. And you can see that, you know, we're getting improvements further down the soil profile, as well as higher up, which is starting to show some of those deeper rooting species. Thank you. I'm just checking the time. There we go. But what's really important is we're not just growing these for the sake of growing these. We're growing these because we're needing them for a function, and actually we're needing to graze them, or we're needing to ensile them. And so how we manage these lays is really, really important. And so what we're seeing over the wider cohort of farmers that we're working with is that the move from set stocking to rotational and or mob grazing seems to be improving the soil carbon levels, and it seems to be doing that from about 0.1 to 0.6% per hectare per year. So we're cautiously optimistic that actually that's a really good strategy in terms of how we manage these. And as I say, if we include those deep rooting species, we can supercharge that process and increase those carbon levels at depths with reduced decomposition. So in order to manage the soil benefits, those swards need to be managed. So it's really important we've got the tools in our fingertips to be able to manage those in a way that is maximising those soil benefits and allowing us the opportunity to draw more carbon in, to allow, you know, to improve the nutrient cycling process. Yes, please. Also, just some work looking at increased nutrient availability. This is some work that's being led by Plymouth, where we're looking at total nutrients within the soil and then looking at how that translates through to crop available nutrients, and whether we can see a difference in these fields which have more diversity on top, whether that's also providing more diversity underneath, and that's translating through in terms of more nutrient being taken up by the crop. That data is currently being crunched, and as I say, we'll bring it when it's been sorted. Thank you. And I suppose just finally, to put it all into context, if we can get these benefits in terms of soil organic matter, then we can pull in, you know, carbon, and we can pull carbon out of the atmosphere and we can hold it in our soil, which is fantastic. And that's what we want to do, because that carbon is not just being pulled out of the atmosphere for a climate change benefit. We can also improve, you know, it's improving our soil agronomically, it's improving all the things that we want it to do in the performance of our soils. If we can also look at reducing our fertilizer application from the inclusion of legumes, then we can also reduce our fertilizer application, which is brilliant. Nitrous oxide is a massive issue, and if we can look at the use of legumes is really interesting. And there's also some really interesting new research going on at the moment showing about plantain, and actually plantain is quite useful at reducing nitrous oxide emissions from clovers during the denitrification. So that's quite interesting in terms of the other additional benefits that some of these plants that are included in the species in the lake can have. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Hang on, I think there's one more. Sorry. I think there's one more I think there's
pardon.
one more slide. It's just to say, you know, all the businesses that we're working with and all the organisations and obviously our fantastic soil carbon project farmers who are allowing us to dig lots of holes all over their fields and ask them lots of interesting questions, probing questions about what they're doing. So yes, that's what we're doing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Oh, I think she went. Oh dear, I think she might have left. Well, I mean, I'm sure you all found that hugely interesting and covered huge amounts of the detail of the questions that were coming in around the roles of different species. It's really interesting that about plantain. I'm not sure, obviously Becky, oh, she's come back, she's back, yay. So if anyone's got any questions specifically on the things that Becky was talking about right then you'd like to put into the chat, then please do. Are you there still, Becky?
Sorry, I fell out and came back in again. Sorry.
Yeah, and you came back. Yay. So I see someone's been asking about metabolizable energy, and Bethan has also replied in the chat there. And I know people have been in the questions that we've had coming in were particularly asking about the roles of different species, which obviously, are you able to say any more about how specific species can, do different jobs?
It's not something that we're looking at massively. I mean, I think we've got, the things that are producing more deeper rooting. We're seeing a benefit in terms of being able to, pull carbon further down, but we've not got trials at the moment looking at the different species in isolation and being able to look at the soil benefits in that sort of level. It's more looking at the mix in the ground. But certainly,
Sure.
as I say, those that have got those deep rooting species and are pulling, are able to access nutrients and water and all those things further down, we're starting to see that some of that biology is moving down as well. But again, we need to start looking at that in more detail. And certainly, as I say, it's something that we will be hopefully doing a bit more work on. This has been a sort of initial look-see, and it's just been that we've got quite a lot of farmers who are using Herbal Leys, which means that we can pull that out. But I think it just highlights that we're at the start of this journey in terms of really being able to quantify and understand what's going on. And we've got to start looking at how we can sort of widen out the research to be able to quantify some of these benefits.
Amazing. We've got hundreds of questions now. So there's one about how does carbon loss from cultivation impact on overall carbon budget across the lifetime of a ley?
Yeah, so we will be seeing some carbon loss from that initial cultivation, but certainly we've got farmers that are establishing them in different ways. And I think establishment was what you were talking about last time, but certainly we're looking at the moment, we've got some trials in the ground where we are measuring how much carbon is lost after different types of cultivation. So we've got, complete plough, and we've got some sort of strip tills and other, and we're actually measuring what's being lost in terms of carbon so that we can then feed that into the models to be able to sort of more accurately budget what's going on in terms of how much is being lost versus how much is coming in, because it's a really important part. If we're having to establish these leys by doing a lot of cultivation at the start, then actually we're reducing the potential of what we can pull in. So we've got to look at the balance between how much carbon we're potentially losing during establishment versus how much we're getting as that ley is actively growing and how long that lays in the ground for. But as I say, some of the cultivation work we're doing at the moment is starting to measure how much is being lost during those different types of cultivation, and we'll be able to feed that into the models.
Brilliant. Okay, super. Thank you very much. So more questions for Becky towards the end. So we'll move on to Sarah now, because obviously part of the whole maintaining species diversity and maintaining these leys is massively down to how you graze them and your approaches to that and residuals that you're leaving to how well these species keep going for a prolonged period of time. So Sarah, can we now move over to you looking at your projects?
Thanks. So yeah, I'm Sarah Morgan and I work at Rothamsted Research. I'm primarily involved in running the AgriTech Cornwall cell grazing project that we have at Northwick. This project is looking at 2 different grazing management regimes that kind of opposite ends of the spectrum of grazing management, and we're mainly looking at the environmental impacts of those 2 different grazing managements. I'm not going to speak too much about the project as it doesn't involve Herbal Leys, but Jordana, who will speak after me, she's talking about a separate project that does involve Herbal Leys. So today I'm just going to introduce different grazing management techniques and really just kickstart a discussion on best grazing management for multi-species swards. Okay, next slide. So I've just put this in as a bit of a reminder, which we probably all don't need because most of you are already growing multi-species swards. But this basically outlines that a multi-species sward needs a minimum of 3 different families of plant species. So it's usually composed of grasses, legumes, and forbs. And you can have multi-species swards that are as simple as 3 different varieties, right up to 20 plus different varieties. So yeah, next slide. So in terms of grazing multi-species leys, these are the types of grazing management that you'd want to avoid ideally. So as Becky mentioned earlier, there is a transition from set stocking or continuous stocking through rotational grazing. So these grazing management systems usually use either a low or medium stocking density, which you want to avoid because you're not getting the most efficiency out of your systems. In terms of the continuous grazing or set stocking, you've got no control of the grazing pressure and there's no rest period for the different fields. But it does allow for fixed watering points and has a relatively low labour input. Similar on a rotational basis, if you're rotating from field to field, you've got a slightly higher stocking rate, so you're using a medium stocking density. But again, there's not much control of the grazing pressure. The fields get rest from time to time, but it does allow for selective grazing, which you want to avoid on a multi-species sward. But it does have fixed watering and low input costs and labour. I've put strip grazing in. So this is a strip grazing which is using just a front fence only. I know some people do strip grazing with a front and back fence, which I'll cover in a minute. So strip grazing is slightly better than continuous and a rotational field basis, as you have got some control over the grazing pressure. But because you're only using a front fence and the animals have access to what they've left behind, the residual, then the residual doesn't get a full rest period, and that can allow for selective grazing of the new regrowth especially, and that's at the point where the plants are very sensitive. So if they get overgrazed at that young stage, then you'll actually lose them out of your ley. But again, this kind of system is sometimes preferred because of its fixed watering point and low labour and input costs. And the next slide. So the basic reasons for avoiding those types of management is because they can lead to a lower persistency of your herbal ley, and persistency is quite a important topic when talking about multi-species leys, because you've got such a variety of different plants and species in that mix, and they'll all have different roles in that mix and different preferences for the grazing. Then some of them will, if you allow preferential grazing, some of them will get overgrazed and you'll lose them out of your sward, and that will shorten the persistency of the sward overall. And in that, you'll also lose your species diversity, which with establishing multi-species leys being a relatively expensive endeavour compared to your conventional seed mixes, then you want to try and keep that ley as persistent and productive and diverse for as long as possible. With that, opportunity to selectively graze, you can also increase the potential for weeds to be introduced into your swards, which again, that will reduce the productivity and the nutritional quality of your sward. And it also leads to poor forage utilisation overall. In terms of conventional swards, the utilisation is around about 50% if you use a set stop to continuous management, which again, that, in terms of the efficiency of your system, you can do things to improve that. Here we've got a picture of the cattle that are on the self-grazing project. These are under set stocked management. I just put this photo in to show, you know, that they've got access to the whole field all the time. And you can start now seeing the effects of the preferential grazing on the sward diversity, etc. So on the next slide, these are more of the grazing managements that you would want to use with a multi-species sward. So there's a lot of different types of essentially rotational grazing, but the key point in these is that they basically use a front and back fence, or the animals are enclosed in a specific area for a specific amount of time. So we've got different management techniques such as a hub and spoke or a rotational paddock grazing system. And with these you use a higher stocking density, which is more preferred as that increases your efficiency and utilisation. You've got control of the grazing pressure. You are having rest periods in your system, which is very important for multi-species swards. Especially to avoid that overgrowing of the young leafy stage of the multi-species. It discourages selective grazing, as I said, and you've got a fixed watering point, and there's a medium labour input and infrastructure cost in terms of setting up those semi-permanent electric fences. But once you have the system set up, then the main labour input is moving the cattle every few days. And then we've got more intense versions, so in terms of rotational mob stocking and cell grazing. So these, again, use a much higher stocking density still, and you've got much more control over the grazing pressure. They've got adjustable rest periods, so during your grazing period, your grazing season, you'll have different rest periods depending on the time of year and the reproductive stage of the plants. It definitely prevents selective grazing. It promotes an even grazing of the pasture that they are allocated for a fixed amount of time, and that also brings with it even distribution of the dung and urine, and even trampling of the soil. Some of the things that possibly put people off going straight to these more intensive styles of grazing management is the need for a movable watering system, and also the higher labour input in terms of setting up fences and moving animals every day or two. But with this more intensive management and more calibrated approach to the grazing, you can get increased production per hectare, better animal performance, and you should be going out to see your cattle or sheep every day anyway to check them for welfare. So if you're spending an extra 5-10 minutes moving a fence for them, then but also getting a profitable benefit at the end of that, then that's at the counter argument to this higher input need. So on the next slide. So the good grazing management will help to prolong the persistency of the sward. So you're avoiding that detrimental selective grazing. So all the species in your sward get an even opportunity to be grazed and also to recover from that grazing period through the rest periods. It will maintain species diversity, increase your forage utilisation, so moving towards more of a mob grazing or a cell grazing approach, you can actually get your forage utilisation up to about 80-90%, and it will also improve animal performance as well. So on the next slide, so one of the things to consider when grazing multi-species swards is some of the methods that are commonly used for a monoculture or ryegrass clover sward don't always apply to a multi-species sward. So one of the main things that I get asked about is how best to measure the pasture covers in a traditional sward. The rising plate meter is having an increased popularity in terms of measuring your average pasture covers, and through that being able to allocate feed to the animals. But in terms of a herbal ley, then the plate meter isn't quite as accurate, because as the herbal ley becomes more mature, then you've got different levels of the different species, and the sward diversity as you go from soil upwards isn't very consistent. So we have been doing some work at Rothamsted to try and overcome this and see whether there's any adaptations we could do to the plate meter itself or to the plate meter equations to improve the accuracy. But the other options are sward stick, or in my experience, most farmers decide when to move their animals on just by eye and assessing it on a frequent basis. One of the key things to consider is what infrastructure do you require to make sure that you set up a good grazing management that's beneficial for your sward. So you need to think about water access, which is very important, and also fencing and labour inputs that are required. Again, related to that, which grazing management method would suit you best and your lifestyle, and also your farm as a whole. Things such as what your target entry and exit covers should be. Generally, we say don't graze a herbal ley below 7 centimetres, and that's for sheep or cattle grazing. But there are some differences in terms of differences and challenges, because measuring the pasture cover, as I said, some of the methods such as plate meters aren't as accurate at the moment for multi-species leys, and you may need to leave a higher residual so that you get a better regrowth from that multi-species swards. And also things like how best to manage your rotation lengths, what is the ideal rotation length for your particular seed mix, etc. So yeah, there's a lot to think about in terms of the grazing management, but I hope that's given people some things to think about, and possibly share your experiences in the chat. So on the next slide, I would just like to say thank you for seeing so many people attending, and yeah, if you've got any questions, pop them in the chat or after.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That's brilliant. So yeah, I mean, that's really covered a lot of the detail about how to measure them, which I know we'd had questions about ahead, and in terms of best grazing approaches. I've seen in the chat there's a lot of conversation around the how they change, the species change throughout time, and and also the risks of losing species after year one if you graze them too hard and then they haven't had a chance to establish. But looks like Hannah and all sorts of people have been on it in terms of answering them, and so I will just hold on any more questions for a second, and we'll move on to Jordana, because I'm conscious again of the time, and obviously do keep putting your questions in the chat, and there's lots of people there who are providing lots of brilliant answers and information of different research projects they're involved with. So thank you very much, Sarah. And Jordana, over to you.
Thanks. Hello everyone, I'm Jordana Rivero, research scientist at Rothamsted Research, and I will present some results from last year in our Institute Strategic Program ASSIST. Next slide, please. So we have a platform with 12 1-hectare plots. We are testing different sward types and contrasting grazing strategies. We have 3 sward types. We have a permanent pasture, which is dominated by perennial ryegrass, a pasture sown with a mix of grasses. These cultivars are selected for highly digestible fiber, It's Festulolional perennial ryegrass cultivars. And we have a multi-species sward. The seed mix contained 15 different species. Oh, sorry, no, that slide. You can see it in the right-hand side in the table. We have 5 grasses, 5 legumes, and 5 forbs. And these sward types don't receive the multi-species sward don't receive inorganic nitrogen, but the permanent pasture and the grass mix do receive inorganic nitrogen, and all the sward types receive obviously P and K. And we apply 2 grazing strategies: the cell grazing that Sarah just described, and the continuous stocking. Next slide, please. Thank you. So in the continuous stocking, our target herbage mass or herbage cover is between 1,800 and 2,000 kilograms dry matter per hectare. And if we have a surplus, if we have more grass that the animals can eat, we just put a mobile fence to fence off some area, either for cutting or for deferred grazing. We try to adjust the grazing area to the stocking rate. So all these plots are grazed by sheep with about 15 ewes and their lambs. We graze from lambing to weaning with ewes and lambs. Then at weaning, we remove the ewes, and the lambs keep grazing until finishing. Obviously, we add more lambs to adjust the stocking rate at weaning. And by the end of the, let's say, the grazing season, by end of October, when we have just a few lambs remaining in the plots, we just kind of finish the experimental measurements, remove all the remaining lambs, and we just graze the different plots with mobs of ewes and the ram, just to a final grazing before the resting period in winter. So November, December, we have a final grazing cycle. Next slide, please. And I forgot to say that we assess the herbage cover with the plate meter, although, as Sarah mentioned, it's not ideal for the multi-species sward. We are trying to see ways to improve our estimations. I think at the moment visually is probably one of the best alternatives, but we are trying to find some adjustments or new equations for the plate meter. In the cell grazing, we have semi-permanent central fence, so we have 2 lanes with 30 virtual cells each. So in total, we have 60 cells. We move the front, we allocate new areas by moving the front and the back fence every 2 to 3 days. So the animals are not grazing the same area for more than 3 days. We have a target entry cover of 2,200 kilograms dry matter and a residual cover of about 1,500, although these values vary day by day, given mainly the variation in animal intake, but also in the pasture growth rate. So it's not that easy to maintain the entry cover and the residual at the target values. Again, we assess the pasture cover once a week with the plate meter, with 1 or 2 plunks in every cell. So we have 60 cells. We take a plunk from each cell. The rotation length, we applied the same rotation length last year to all the plots, and at the beginning was a 20 days rotation, and that was because we had a lot of grass at the beginning of the grazing season, and we were limited in the number of sheep to put in the plots. So the way of controlling the pasture cover, so they don't get away, we try to accelerate the rotation to keep on top of the covers. We could have put more animals and have a longer rotation. That could have been also an alternative. So for most of the grazing season, we have a 20 days rotation. Maybe for the multi-species sward, we could have tried a longer rotation, maybe 4 weeks or even 5 weeks. But at the end of the grazing cycle, we had a 30 days rotation. And we applied the same grazing cycle as in the continuous stocking, with the grazing mobs in November, December, before the winter resting period. Next slide, please. So here you can see an aerial photograph of the plots. Next, please. In yellow, we have the 6 cell grazing plots. You can see there the dashed line is the central semi-permanent fence. And you can see clearly the gradient on pasture cover, the area that the animals are grazing now, the area the animals will be moved the next day, it's the greener, and the green-yellow area is the area that they just grazed the couple of days before. And the white areas, the white perimeters are the the continuous stocking plots. Next slide, please. So to cover some results, you can see this is the average herbage mass from April to end of October. You can see that the cell grazing was consistently higher in herbage mass compared with the continuous stocking, given the resting period that this grazing management impose. And in particularly, the Herbal Leys showed a higher cover than the other swords. Obviously, again, we measured this with the plane meter, but it was visually obvious in the field as well that the multi-species sward had a higher average of pasture cover. Again, we could have used more animals to utilize this higher herbage. Next slide, please. Here is the total live weight gain per hectare from April to end of October. In the multi-species sward, they have on average the higher values, and they were similar. So it wasn't an effect of the grazing strategy. They had above 1,000 kilograms each. In the permanent pasture, there was a trend for the cell grazing to have a higher productivity, and definitely for the grass mix, the cell grazing favored the productivity compared with the continuous stocking. And next slide, please. And this is the average daily gain of the lambs. There was no effect of the sward type nor the grazing strategy. So all the lambs grew well on average 240 grams per day. And I think this was a good finding because it shows that in a permanent pasture that is very common, or a grass mix that was selected for highly digestible fiber, so providing more energy, the multi-species sward provided very good food and even feed, and even with a restricted grazing, as is the case of the cell grazing, where the animals can only eat what is there. That didn't restrict the animal performance, with what I think it's a very good finding. Next slide, please. So regarding botanical composition, here, yes, that one, yes. So here is comparing March 2019, so before we put the animals on the plots, with March 2020, this year, before we started the next grazing season. So this shows the variation due to the activity last year. So in the numbers of species, this is an average of different species, the zone species, per plot. In the seed mix, if you remember, we had 15 species, but in average, the plots had about 8 species. It doesn't necessarily mean that there were only 8 species, the same all 8 species in all the plots. Could be different combinations, but on average, we didn't have 15 as in the seed mix, but only 8. So the number of zone species decreased in time, and that's in the total number of species. And regarding the per family, you can see that the grasses, there was also a decrease in time. But interestingly, the grazing system helped to reduce that loss of diversity. So particularly for the forbs, you can see that there's a marked decrease in the number of species from 2019 to 2018, but the decrease was lower with the cell grazing compared with the continuous. And for the other two groups, legumes and grasses, there was a trend also with the cell grazing helping to reduce that loss in diversity. Next slide, please. And the previous slide was about the number of species. This is the percentage of the soil covered by the species. There was also a decrease in the total percentage of cover of all the zone species from one year to the other, but that didn't happen in the grasses. So the grasses were able to maintain their cover across time, so they didn't change. For the other groups, we can see that legumes and forbs also decreased, and there was an effect of the grazing system, so that decrease was similar between grazing systems. However, the percentage of cover of weeds was affected by the grazing system, so the cell grazing was able to reduce that increment on the number on the cover of weeds. You can see there that the increase in the continuous stocking was probably more than double than the increase in the cell grazing, which is good. But at the same time, in the cell grazing, we tended to have a higher increase in the percentage of bare ground. And I think this could be due to the selective or the removal of some species that had a more horizontal growth habit. That could have been the case with that. And next slide, please. I think that was the last one. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's really, really interesting and just demonstrates how cell grazing really is the way to go. There's been lots of good questions. There's some discussion around shelter and obviously the issues of providing shelter for animals in systems with cell grazing or set stocking and the challenges of that. Could whoever Jay is mute their microphone, please? Thank you. But then I've also got some other particular questions about, so one from Paul Mutto about the species mixes and the percentage of the seed mixes which were non-grass species. Are you able to answer that one? Have we lost you?
Yeah.
Sorry.
In the seed mix, we had about 30% of legumes in the seed mix, and about 20% of forbs, and the rest was grasses. We have 15 species, but some of those species had different cultivars of wild types. So in total, we have about 22 different materials, but that was the proportion. 30% legumes to try to ensure a good nitrogen fixation, and 50% grasses and 24.
Okay. Brilliant. Okay, and Emily Grant's asking about will targeting covers to 2,200 to 1,500 kilograms and a 20-day rotation just favour grasses and white clover? I guess it's
well, I think that will depend on many factors. Probably the stocking rate could also affect that, the selective grazing of the different species, but probably I think we could have favored the other species with a longer rotation, probably.
okay.
But as I said, we had plenty of grass last year, so we try to just accelerate the rotation to try to keep on top of pasture. But I think definitely a longer rotation will favor the other species.
Okay, lovely, thank you. And Gary Spence was just asking about nitrogen and how much nitrogen the plots received.
Okay, so as I said, in the multi-species sward, we didn't add inorganic nitrogen. We did apply nitrogen to the other plots. Last year we applied less than expected. It was about 120 kilograms. This year the target, and particularly for the grass mix sward, our target was higher, about 160 to 100, depending on the weather conditions. But obviously this very dry period was not good for fertilizer. So yeah, the idea is in the range of 160 to 200. We think that with the legumes, we can fix about 150 kilograms easily. So ideally, we'll try to add the same amount of inorganic nitrogen to the other two sward types.
Okay, super. And I will just do one more because I know we're desperately running out of time. Just about worming and the worming regimes from Ian and David Horsley. Was there any differences across the different approaches?
Last year we were worming based on fecal egg count. There was a worming at winning, I think, yes, at winning, and then we monitored the fecal egg count to treat according to the results. And we have the data. I haven't analyzed those data yet, but I think there wasn't any difference between the plots, which
Okay.
we were expecting the nature base to have less collect counts, but I think that wasn't the case last year.
I see. Perfect. Well, thank you ever so much. That was brilliant. Covered huge amounts of ground. If you obviously be towards the end, we may have to pick up some more questions, or if there's any bits in the chat you're able to respond to,
Yeah,
that
I'll
would
go
be
to it
super.
now.
Thank you. Right, we will crack on. So now we're going to look at ensiling with Kate and with Dave. So I will very hastily hand over to you guys. Are you there, Kate?
Is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you. Hooray!
Hi everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Kate Lecoq, one of the postdocs at Northwick, and I'm going to discuss the ensiling research that I've been carrying out as part of the Tom's Toolbox of Multi-Species Swards project, which is a collaboration with Duchy College. I've listed all of our funder and collaborators here on this slide at the bottom, and we're really grateful that we're able to carry out this work with their support. Next slide, please. Can I get the next slide, please?
The online toolbox.
There are many aspects to the Tom's. That's it, Fab, thank you. There's many aspects to the project. Today, I'm just going to focus on the areas in yellow, but this slide just gives you an outline of all of the things that we're covering as part of this. But keep your eyes out for other events in the future that will cover other areas within this project. Next slide, please. So the previous talks in this series have covered the possible benefits of grazing herbal leys. We've had some great talks already. In silage production, there are also some potential benefits that you could see from using a herbal ley, but there's also some challenges, and I know that there are things that a lot of people are facing at the moment. So we know that the addition of legumes to an ensiled crop can improve the aerobic stability of silage. And also the presence of plant compounds have an array of effects on silage. These can include the palatability, effects on the rumen fermentation, and for example, the presence of tannins, which inhibit protein degradation. So there is a lack of knowledge in this area in elucidating the specific mechanisms. So we don't understand everything that's going on at the moment. And also due to the deep rooting properties of some varieties, you might see increased drought tolerance, and we know that that's increasingly important. So the challenges that might arise from using herbal leys, in a lot of cases, we don't have enough information to suggest a blanket best practice for all herbal leys. Lots of farmers are successful, and this is mostly through trial and error, but obviously this can be daunting and an economic risk for farmers who are starting out with herbal leys. So we hope that the toolbox from the Tom's project will help to inform farmers making choices that are right for their farms. And also we know that a lot of farmers are using herbal leys in conjunction with the environmental stewardship schemes. So we might talk a little bit about that later as well. So one of the main challenges with herbal leys is the quality and yield variation from the sward in the field. This inconsistency will directly relate to the variation that we then see within bales and the clamp, and this makes it difficult to maintain a consistent day-to-day feed. In addition, analysis of herbal silage from herbal leys is a challenge because NIRS calibrations will not be able to accurately determine the nutritional content of silage from mixed swards because they're designed for perennial ryegrass silages. Could I have the next slide, please, Catherine? So in the TOMS experiment, we've carried out a plot scale experiment and we produced silage from each plot in test tubes. Here we tested the efficacy of an inoculant to lower the pH of the silage, and we did this on the plots last year. So the experimental goal is to look at sward type, the dry matter content at Ensiling, and the inoculant. So I'm going to concentrate on those two today. And on the right hand side of the slide, you could see the layout of the plot, which I think Deb went through in more detail last week. And with the silage that we make from these, we're looking at the fermentation quality and also the nutritional value. Unfortunately, I don't have all of the results back yet from the experiment I did last year, but I'll talk you through some of the principles that have arisen from this work. Next slide, please. So the seed mixes that we have in the TOMS experiment are a binary control, which is the perennial ryegrass and white clover treatment. And then we've got mix A, which is a 6 species mix. And we have mix B and also a high diversity mix, which is 18 species. For the silage work, because of the establishment, which was very similar between mix A and mix B, we only used the 3 highlighted mixes to make silage with in the experiment last year. And we used the conventional sowing rate. Next slide, please. So these are the pH results from the 3 different forage types. And each of the forage types was either treated as a control or with the addition of inoculant 2 or inoculant 3. So the 6 species mix is in red, and the high diversity is green, and the binary control is in purple. So here, the pH drop is important because the faster it happens, the more protein and sugar will be preserved in the crop. So you can see here the solid lines represent the control that had no inoculant added. And in almost all cases, these the inoculant treatment resulted in a faster pH drop in all of the forage types. I will disclose at this moment that the dry matter of these crops at Ensiling was very, very high. Because it's a plot experiment, when we were cutting them, they were drying pretty much as fast as I could bring them in. So I'll show you on the next slide, please. The end result. So the first graph shows the dry matter at Ensiling for each plot. So again, we've got the 3 different mixes and then the dry matter of the 3 different plots. So you can see here that the dry matter of the binary control plots are actually the most consistent and fall in the middle. And then the 6 species mix, 2 of the plots fall right at the bottom of that scale, 1 of them right at the top, and with the Herbal Ley again. So we think that this could also be yield dependent as well. Obviously, if you've got a lower yield, those plots are going to dry much, much faster. The pH at day 90, I've just taken a snapshot of the pH at day 90, and you can see from this that in the stable silage, the control pHs were always higher than the inoculant treated. Next slide, please. So the work that I'm doing in 2020 will be focusing on the dry matter at Ensiling because this really is critical. In a bale, the target dry matter would be 35 to 45%, and for the clamp, 30 to 32%. So I'm going to focus on controlling the dry matter at Ensiling by changing the wilt time. So the data on this slide is, they're actually from a different experiment in preparation for this year's experiment, and the treatments compared are similar to the TOMS with a perennial ryegrass, control, a 6 species mix and a 17 species herbal mix. So you can see from this that the perennial ryegrass treatment actually started out the driest at cutting, so at time 0, and the 6 species and herbal mix were much closer. So this is something to bear in mind, that actually, for example, with this data, we were hitting the target closer to 4 hours after mowing, and I continued to measure the dry matter up to 28 hours afterwards. Next slide, please. This slide is just an example of an NIR analysis. It's from a grass haylage, not a multi-species sward, but I just wanted to show where the NIRS calibration is not appropriate for a sample type, just how inaccurate it can be. So this graph is comparing the results of samples that were compared with wet chemistry compared to the NIRS results, and as you can see that in a lot of cases these are very different in sugar analysis. Next slide, please. So after the last seminar, we got sent in quite a lot of questions, and some of these were silage related. So someone's not muted, I can hear lots of noise, sorry. So I put a couple of these questions on the end of my slide, and I'm also going to invite Dave Davies to comment on these. So there's 2 questions here. They both relate to cutting time. So if you could just flick on to the next slide as well, please, Catherine. And I'm going to answer them together. So both of them ask about cutting time, and also this second one brings up the requirements of the environmental stewardship scheme, which is quite important if you're trying to manage your silage for a high quality cut, as well as fulfilling those requirements. So it's really good to see that they're being managed with a view to deliver this high quality cut. Cutting should be occurring before any seed head develops for that high quality. And also because they're in the vegetative growth, recovery will be faster, and then the ability of those plants to compete will be better, providing that they're cut high enough to avoid cutting off the growing crown of the plant. And I think I saw Hannah talking about in the chat before. With regards to the red clover being in flower, I think 20% is probably just about the limit, and it's important to bear in mind that at 50% the proteins will have dropped by 2% as a ballpark figure. So that's the end of my presentation, but Dave, do you have anything to add on those questions?
Thanks, Kate. You covered things very well. I'd just like to really reiterate the importance of your dry matter targets, particularly for clamp silage, because there's a high risk of aerobic spoilage, even with the multi-species swards, if you're drying too much. And this year, given the drag we've had, we're already starting at a very dry level at cutting. And secondly, the issue of NIR. I think there's a lot of belief when you get a piece of paper back that that piece of paper is correct, and all your multi-species swards will be being analysed by NIR with a grass database, and your results may be very different, and in some situations it won't even give you a gauge. So in terms of looking at that digestibility and the digestibility, there was a question about ME earlier. If you have a D value, a digestibility value, and you multiply that by 0.16, you get the ME. And the best way to estimate your digestibility is really looking at the leafiness. So if it's 100% leaf, it'll be 70% D. If you've got seed ends emerging, then it drops to 70 to, or 68 to 70. And when you get to full seed head, you're down at 60 to 58. So that's just a way you can look at it in the field. I think that's everything I'd like to say at this stage, and please ask questions.
Thank you ever so much, both of you. That's really brilliant. Loads of information there. There had been quite a few questions ahead on hay making with multi-species lays. I don't know if you, I keep looking at the clock, but I really don't want to miss the opportunity to hear from you guys. So if you got any thoughts on, optimum dry matters or any kind of things that people need to think about when making hay out of multi-species lays. To Dave or Kate, if you're there.
I would encourage people not to make hay.
Okay.
My reasoning. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, you're dipping in and out a bit, but you're back now.
I would encourage people not to make hay out of multi-species sward.
Okay.
Reason being that when you dry your legumes and to a lesser extent your what I was saying was I'd encourage people not to make hay of multi-species swards, because when you dry your legumes in particular to 85–90% dry matter, which is what you need for hay, you tend to lose all the leaf in the field, and that's what it is. Leaf shatter is a key problem in the legumes, and so you will reduce your protein content drastically by making it too dry. And that's why the targets that Kate mentioned of 30 to 32 in the clamp and 35 to 45% in the bale are very important, not only because that's when fermentation and silage quality are better, but also because you reduce your amount of leaf shatter, which is significant in the legume crops.
I see. Perfect. Well, yeah. that's there. Thank you very much. I'm really aware of time, so if people, there's another question there about minimum dry matter values differing from standard. Perhaps if you were able to answer that one in the chat, that would be great, and we will just quickly move on, because I appreciate we're probably going to run over by a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to, I don't want to miss out on you hearing from Clyde, and I just wanted to say a very few words about Innovative Farmers, which is a program that the Soil Association lead on. It's a not-for-profit membership network, and it's about getting farmers and growers together with research to develop their own on-farm trials and to really answer the questions that are important to them. It sort of provides a researcher to come along with a group of farmers who've got a question that they want to answer, to help them develop a robust trial, decide what sort of data they want to collect, and also provides funds to buy seed or do testing or do whatever additional things that they might need to do, and take the risk away from doing that trial. So we have got, if you move on to the next one, Kat. So we've been running a trial with a group of dairy farmers looking at Herbal Leys and looking at the grazing pressure and the effect of that on species diversity, and try basically splitting a paddock in two and grazing one side at what the farmer would consider to be their sort of optimum residual, and then the other side they've been leaving it a bit longer, and we're monitoring the impact of that sort of leaving the residual a bit longer on species diversity overall. But there are a whole host of other field labs that have been looking at Herbal Leys. There's one up more in the north of the country looking at leys on rushy pasture and seeing if that can have an impact. There's another one about bringing Herbal Leys into arable systems and how they can obviously benefit the soil and provide a pest break. So there's one on that one. There's been another one which is quite a slow ongoing one, looking at the different mineral properties of different species that Lupo's been leading on. So just to say, do please go and look at the Innovative Farmers website if you haven't already, and follow some of the activity that we're doing with some of this this on-farm research, because obviously that's where we can get a lot of the answers really quite quickly. But I will just quickly pass over to I will include Clyde, I should say. So Clyde Jones has been part of our field lab on the dairy herbal leys for some time, and he's brought into the fold as well of the Fabulous Farmers Network. And Clyde's you've been working with herbal leys, particularly in dairy systems, haven't you, for some time? And I was just wanting to get a little bit of your experience, really. So if you were able just to focusing, as this session's focusing on grazing and also a bit about the silage making, if you've got any thoughts on your sort of in practice experience of grazing herbal leys and what you would recommend.
Right, certainly. I was running a 500 cow spring calving unit on a very dry farm in the south of England. We've frequently run out of grass, despite elongating the rotation to 40 days and so on. So I looked at herbal leys and put them in 2013 on 16 hectares. That worked really well. So we followed on from 50 hectares and ended up 75% of the land going into herbals. But prior to that, or during that, 2015, I went up to New Zealand with the Positive Farmers, mostly Irish farmers. We went to a farm, Colin Armour's, and he has a lot of cows. He has units. He has 60,000 cows in total, but he'll have a unit, a blueprint of 1,000 cows with 3 people running it. A very, very simple system, spring calving, and it's all about the profit per hectare. But I noticed his grasses weren't particularly flash. In fact, they looked like permanent pasture. And what the guys were doing, as they couldn't make any silage and they couldn't feed any supplements, so they were holding some of the residuals back at the end of the paddocks to feed later on when it became dry. So that inspired me. And when the herbals came on, I could see the lack of ryegrass enabled me to store the grass, the forage over. And so upon reading Andre Vassan's book, The Grass Productivity, we realized there's a lot more flexibility without ryegrass. And so you can store, particularly on a dry farm, you can store the forage ahead of you and then set up a fixed rotation. And if on a 30-day rotation, for instance, you get 3 feeds on there, on a 60-day, you get 6 feeds. So it's very, very simple to set up. You can go around clockwise or you can go around anti-clockwise. And you have a particular marker paddock that you gauge the yield. So you can work out what the cows are taking in, if the yield is spot on to what you think it will be, and then gauge the rest of it from there. So you're not flying completely blind, but you will not use, we did use a plate meter, to be fair, to get a guide, particularly coming up to that marker paddock. But by and large, we didn't need to use a plate meter. I've seen a few systems like this, quite old, nothing new in it. And in fact, you just set it up and the cows go around. Obviously, you're monitoring yield all the time anyway, and come serving, you're monitoring how you're getting on that way. But you have different lengths of rotation, and rotation is the most important. Days rest for these herbals, the most important thing we found. So it would vary between 28, 30, 35, 40, 45 days around about now. You'd stretch it out a bit more, and then 60 days later. The other thing to add, I was a slight luxury in that I had a runoff, so we had a completely separate area we could take the cows to for out wintering, a particularly dry area. And then we'd set that up initially with a hurricane type mix, which is Italian ryegrass with some herbals in there. And then that was used for outwintering with bales, 3 cuts, and then bales to put to the side, deferred grazing to go into. So a very simple system, and the herbals work well with it.
Brilliant, thanks. So it's basically all about making sure there's plenty of rest time, isn't it?
Yes,
And setting up your rotations so there's plenty of rest so it can all recover and you don't overdo it on each grazing.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. And if you're in a big paddock, they weren't identical sizes, so you didn't have to set up anything particularly fancy, but you knew what your consumption of the paddock should be. So if you're on a particularly big one, and say in there for 6 feet, you would back fence and move a water trough and so on. So you just, so long as you've got a degree of flexibility, it can work really well.
Yeah, and in regarding species, you generally found that, you know, you had relatively good persistence of species, so, or do you just accept that you've got this moving feast between different herbs and legumes and grasses? Or
yes, I mean, it was a lower pH area, like I say, it was sand over gravel, so there wasn't a lot of sample and lucerne and so on. We got a little flush to begin with various things, but obviously people are finding the whole thing is dynamic, and you'll get a nice flush of smaller species at the beginning, and then some will stay right the way through. But we put in Italian ryegrass as like a cover or nurse crop before the Timothy's and the Cocksfoot came in, so you had something to go into, so you weren't punishing the other plants. But just to ignore the Italian, just use it for what it is, and not get too upset about it heading and so on. But you had something to go into to fortify the mix in the first couple of years.
Sure. Okay, brilliant. And then just silage making. What did you got any thoughts on, or your experience of silage making with it?
Yeah, the intention, to say, on the spring milking block was not to make silage, and to keep it simple.
I see.
And then you gauge a rotation. The runoff there, that was specialised in silage making, and then that was just making it into bales, but making sure the double wrap that went round. And if you needed to wrap the bales, net the bales, should I say, so double net, take them off the paddock because of the stems, and then double wrap them with plastic elsewhere, and then bring them back onto an area which you know is clear, so you could set up for the winter. But there's the danger of the stems puncturing the plastic.
Sure, yeah, we had quite a few questions actually coming in with people registering about the fear of the chicory stems, particularly, yes. Piercing plastic.
But the cows loved it. I mean, it didn't look particularly good, and some of the stockmen would think, oh, open the plastic and be horrified, but they wouldn't eat the stem, but they eat everything else, and they loved it, particularly obviously red clover is very good. So yeah, it went down well.
Excellent, thank you. I'm just gonna, I think what I'll do now, because I've noticed it's 1 o'clock, I will just round us off, but then Clyde and all of the other speakers will still be here after 1 o'clock if there's more questions that people want to ask and want to just carry on. But if I just say thank you very much to Clyde at the moment, and I'll thank everybody else, and just round up, and then we'll do some more questions. So Kat, if you can just lead on to the last slide. So and skip that one. Yep. As we've managed to do such a brilliant job of taking questions as we've gone along, and obviously all the speakers have been excellent answering those, and there's been all sorts of lovely chat activity and with people answering things for everyone, and I really appreciate that, because we did evidently probably try and fit far too much into our time slot, which is always the way. But I would just massively like to thank Becky Wilson, Sarah Morgan, Jordana, Rivero, Kate Lecoq and Dave Davies, and obviously also Clyde, for all of your contributions and for all of you and all of your questions. I will just bring in Katie Bliss from Agricology very quickly. Katie, you there? Because I know she wanted to mention another event on Monday.
Yeah, just very quickly, just wanted to say, so on Monday afternoon at 5 o'clock, we're going to have a session at the Cereal Soil Pit, or a mini version of with NIAB, and we'll be looking at leys in arable rotation. So we will be looking at the soil element of that, and also collaboration between livestock and arable farmers, and therefore bring in kind of the health benefits, animal health benefits of that. So you can see details on the Agricology website.
Brilliant, thank you, Katie, and we'll circulate a link when we follow up. So the session today was all recorded, and obviously and the one we had 2 weeks ago, we'll make sure we send links around so that you can catch up on that session if you missed it. But otherwise, I will officially say thank you very much to everyone, and do stay in touch with Agricology, and please stay in touch with Fabulous Farmers if you're interested in being part of a network. But if you'd like to stay on, if you've got any more questions for any of the speakers, or if you'd like to just unmute your mic and ask them straight out, then please do. Then, you know, please go ahead. We will be around for, well, as long as you need us, basically. But otherwise, I understand if you've got other things to be doing. So if we've got any more questions that people want to ask. If anyone has anything they want to say to
Hi Kate, it's Hannah here.
Hi Hannah. Hi.
You all right?
Yes, I'm all right.
Managed to join you briefly. I'd just like to say for the Herbal Leys, we've just got some latest results from the TONS project, which Kate was talking about earlier. From our farm sites, the Herbal Leys had significantly higher calcium and sulphur compared to a ryegrass and white clover mix, and the farmer's control as well. We looked at a whole range of micronutrients, but it was the calcium and sulphur that came out on top. Okay.
Thank you for that off the press.
Yeah, we haven't talked about minerals at all, so I thought yeah, I should say there's more data to come.
There's a question to Clyde about from Bridget. I've struggled to get info. Sorry, something's gone across my screen. Struggled to get info on dairy rather than live weight gain measurements. Where can I find something to look at?
Well, that's a good question. Regards, yeah, there's not a lot out there. Yeah, with regards milk yields, I mean, we ended up at 4,500 litres for the year, minimal amount of cake, but we filled in a huge, massive trough that was in the summer dry period with the Herbal Leys, and that kept them going. So we were measuring milk solids as well. We would have been doing peaks of nothing massive, 24 litres on a spring calving herd, and then that would have carried on going 2018 and so on through the year. But
Bridget just says, what kind of cake is that? She said, how much is minimal amounts?
Right. Well, we wouldn't go any more than 6, but we do a 3 or 4 at the beginning of the season, and then drop down to 2 throughout the season. Mm-hmm. So, and that would be a low protein cake, something particularly flash, like soya hulls, sugar beet mix, that sort of thing. That was cheap.
Mm-hmm. And solids, milk solids per cow?
We were up at nearly 400 kilograms milk solids. So it was as I say, with the Collinama in New Zealand, he'll be going on profit per hectare, and so we were focusing on that as well. But yeah, our cost of production was around 24 pence per litre.
I know certainly Peter Cheek is one of the other farmers who's on the Dairy Herbal Leys group, and he was just saying about in terms of he's only got a certain amount of Herbal Ley down, but as they move from that one onto back onto the kind of straightforward clover ryegrass type swards, he didn't necessarily it all seems relatively stable. So obviously
well, frustratingly, come September time, we got a flush of rain. We'd actually get a slight increase in yield from the ryegrasses, which was a bit annoying. But that would be on the back of having to fertilise it, top it, silage make it, and all the rest. But with the herbals, your inputs are so much less, and so you'd easily make up for that litre ahead quite easily. But it's important to keep the legumes in appearance, otherwise you get too much of a bacteriology in the soil, you'll get too much grasses. So it's important to keep the nitrogen down and so on, to encourage all the forbs and the legumes. That's where the milk yields will be.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you. There's obviously lots of chat going on around seed mixes and the issues with chicory not being that persistent and other options. And I think it looks like that the Northwick team are looking at other varieties and other native plants that they might be able to choose. So that's brilliant. Thank you. Well, I don't want to keep people here unnecessarily, but if there's any other, oh, just another question. Could you just reiterate about the cake? How much cake you're feeding?
About maximum of 800. 800 on a year like this, it would go up a bit, so it would be around a ton, but it generally wouldn't be any more than a ton per cow, and it would be, as I say, a cheaper type of cake, so it would be less expensive.
Sure. Excellent.
I wouldn't like to encourage anybody to feed barley with it. We did try that, particularly having an arable section to the estate, but obviously it could lead to bloat, and if it's not quite right, you can get problems in a transition period if you're converting formerly arable fields with Herbal Leys. And despite having tannins in the mix, they may not appear in the actual sward. So there has to be a fair amount of caution. And if you was to go in with a particularly potent rocket fuel type Herbal Ley with lots of clover and feeding barley on top of that wouldn't be a good idea. No.
No, sure. Understand. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Well, I think as everything's quietened down, and thank you. Oh no. Bridget was just asking about barley. Do you see that lower amounts of barley? Okay.
If you're very confident. Yes, yeah, 1 kilogram should be okay, but make sure you're feeding some oil with it would be a great thing to do. And magnesium levels are okay, and salt on offer, rock salt at all times, so you should cover yourself on that. And it is very tempting because it's very cheap and it's a good product, but it can be a problem with potent leys.
Okay, brilliant. If there's anything else, Jack, is a lot of supplementation at the shoulders of the years. How does the forage growth curve compare to the perennial ryegrass growth curve?
Yeah, it would call for a spring calving herd to be calving in March rather than February.
I see.
We stuck to February because we were a very dry farm and we were playing to our strengths, and so therefore we held on to 25% ryegrass so we could have an early turnout. But given another scenario, I would calve later. And then it's a case of, for the other end of the year, is to build up the covers preceding that, and it's good to do that, and you can build it up. You would start doing that around about now, in fact, in July, building up those covers, pushing the round out, and then you can get out to a 60-day or even longer rotation. Then you can, I mean, it should be another drought would be a problem, but otherwise you'd build a cover up and you can see exactly where you're going. So as I say, the idea was not to make any supplements and not to feed any other than cake, a cheap form of cake.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely minimize as possibly can. Yeah, sure. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Clyde, and thank you very much to all of the other speakers. And as I say, if anyone's got more questions that they want to direct, straight to the speakers, then do get in touch with them, or get in touch with me, and I can send you their details. But otherwise, I'll say goodbye and thank you all. Okay, bye.
Bye.